The final nail in Silas's coffin was also the first in Elara's. She stood beside the raw earth of the grave, a solitary figure in black wool, the fabric already too warm for the aggressive spring sun. The people of Providence offered their condolences with the same sterile efficiency they applied to salting a hog, a necessary chore quickly done. They saw a widow, young and childless, an unfortunate appendage to a man now gone. They did not see a partner, the quiet mind that had helped Silas plan the crop rotations, the steady hand that had set his broken leg last winter. They saw only a problem to be solved. Her brother-in-law, Jedediah Graves, solved it. He was a thick man, built of the same stubborn rock and hard soil as his farm, and he considered Elara little more than a temporary tenant on his family's property. After the last mourner had drifted back toward town, he stood before her in the parlor of the house she had called home for 5 years. He held a single sheet of paper. His wife Martha hovered behind him, her face a pinched mask of pious sorrow that did little to hide her satisfaction. "The will is simple, Elara," Jedediah began, his voice devoid of sympathy. Silas, being of sound mind, understood his duty to the family line. This house, the 160 acres of good bottom land, the livestock, the equipment, it all remains with the Graves family. It reverts to me, as is proper. Elara said nothing. She had expected this. The Graves family closed ranks like a fist. She was not blood. She was an outsider, a stray Silas had brought home, and now the door was closing. Burro, Silas's old loping hound, rested his graying muzzle on her knee, sensing the tremor she refused to let show on her face. "He did not leave you with nothing," Jedediah continued, as if announcing an act of great charity. He slid a small, worn leather pouch across the polished table. The clink of coins was pathetic, a sound of finality. $50, and the deed to the sump. Martha let out a small, sharp gasp, a sound of performative shock. The sump. Even the name was an insult. It was a 5-acre plot of worthless land, miles from town, a rocky, sun-scorched patch where nothing grew but thistle and regret. It was known for one thing, the collapsed ruin of an old root cellar from a homestead abandoned 50 years prior. It was a place children were warned away from, a scar on the landscape. It was a joke. "It is land, free and clear," Jedediah said, his eyes hard. "More than many have." He was washing his hands of her, of his brother's memory. She was now a problem solved, a loose thread snipped from the family tapestry. The next morning, the town of Providence watched her departure. She did not weep or beg. She did not plead her case to the pastor or the sheriff. She walked into Mr. Gable's mercantile, the $50 a cold weight in her pocket. Gable, a man whose opinions were as neatly stacked as the bolts of calico on his shelves, leaned on the counter. "A tragedy, Elara, a true tragedy," he said, polishing a smudge on the wood. "Jedediah is a hard man, but practical. You should take that money and buy a ticket back east. There's nothing for a woman alone out here." "I need supplies," she said, her voice flat. He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. "Now, Elara, don't you be stubborn. There is no shame in accepting charity. The church—" "A good axe," she interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "A shovel with a reinforced spine, a pick, 2 galvanized buckets, and 50 pounds of salt." Gable stared at her. The request was absurd. It was the list of a man starting a claim, not a destitute widow. The other patrons in the store fell silent, listening. The whispers had already started. They said the grief had unsettled her mind. "That will be nearly all your money," he said, his voice laced with pity. "What for?" "For my property," she replied. The word hung in the air, ridiculous. property. She owned a hole in the ground. Gable shook his head slowly, a sad smile on his lips. "As you wish." He sold her the tools. She left the mercantile with less than $5 to her name, the heavy weight of the axe head and shovel blade a strange comfort in her hands. She did not look back at the faces in the window, at the pity and the mockery. She turned her back on Providence, whistled once for Boro, and began the long walk toward the sump. The sun beat down, a hammer on the anvil of the sky. She was walking toward her inheritance, a place everyone knew was worthless. She was walking toward the only thing she had left. The journey was a penance. The path dissolved from a wagon-rutted track into a faint deer trail that stitched its way through cracked earth and skeletal brush. The weight of the tools dug into her shoulders, and the sun leached the moisture from her body. Boro trotted silently beside her, his tongue lolling, his presence a steady, warm anchor in the vast, indifferent landscape. By the time she saw the slight rise of her land, the sun was a molten coin sinking into the dusty horizon, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She crested the rise and stopped, and for the first time a wave of pure, cold despair washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. It was worse than the stories. It was a wound in the earth. A deep, rectangular pit yawned before her, choked with the rubble of a collapsed stone foundation and the skeletal remains of ancient timbers. The land around it was pale and dead, littered with rocks and thorny weeds. There were no trees to speak of, only a few stunted, wind-tormented junipers that clung to the edges of the property like beggars. This was it. Her $50, her sweat, her stubborn pride had brought her to this. A grave. A pre-dug grave on 5 acres of hell. The town was right. Jedediah was right. Mr. Gable was right. She was a fool, a madwoman chasing a ghost. The tears she had refused to shed at the funeral, in the parlor, in the town, now came, hot and stinging. She sank to her knees at the edge of the pit, the rough handle of the shovel pressing into her cheek, and she wept. Boro whined softly, nudging her hand with his wet nose. He didn't understand her sorrow, only that it was a heavy thing. As the last light bled from the sky, casting the world in shades of bruised purple and gray, the dog padded away from her. He began to snuffle at the bottom of the pit, near a section where the collapse had been most severe, where a great mound of earth had slumped inward. He started to dig, not with the frantic energy of chasing a rabbit, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, his paws sending up puffs of pale dust. Ilara watched him through blurry eyes, her grief slowly giving way to a weary curiosity. He kept digging at the same spot, whining with a low growl of concentration. She wiped her face on her sleeve, her body stiff with exhaustion and sorrow, and slid down the unstable slope of the pit to see what he had found. She knelt beside him. The dust he had kicked up was not the fine, dry powder of the surrounding land. It was heavier, darker. She reached out and touched the earth where he had been digging. It was cool. Not just cool from the evening air, but deeply, fundamentally cool. It was damp to the touch. Her heart gave a small, painful lurch. She took the shovel and pushed the tip into the spot. It sank in with a soft, sucking sound, a sound utterly alien in this baked and broken place. She dug out a shovelful. The soil beneath was not soil at all. It was clay, thick, gray, and moist. She dug another shovelful, and then another. A foot down, the clay was slick. 2 feet, and it was wet. And then she saw it. A dark line appeared at the bottom of her small hole. Water. It wasn't a gush, not a spring, but a slow, magical bead of moisture oozing from the clay. a seep. Slow, patient, and persistent. Hidden deep beneath the rubble and ruin, protected from the punishing sun, was the one thing more precious than gold in this country: water. She pressed her palm into the muddy bottom of the hole and felt the impossible coolness spread through her hand, up her arm, and into her soul. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, beaten back by a new feeling, something hard and sharp and forged in the fire of her grief. It was resolve. The world had given her a ruin, but deep inside that ruin it had hidden a secret. The work began at dawn. It was a battle fought with muscle and leverage against the dead weight of the past. The first task was to clear the rubble from the pit. Each stone of the collapsed foundation was a monument to her own weakness. The first one she tried to lift barely budged, sending a searing pain through her back. Her hands, soft from years of mending and baking, were raw and blistered by noon. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept working. She learned the language of the stones. She learned to use a smaller rock as a fulcrum and a splintered timber as a lever. She learned to roll the larger boulders rather than lift them, her body screaming with the effort. Boro watched her, a silent guardian at the lip of the pit, occasionally letting out a low growl at a hawk circling overhead. Each stone she moved was a small victory, a piece of the past she was claiming for her future. She stacked them meticulously around the edge of the pit, creating a low, growing wall. As she dug deeper, clearing the earth and broken wood, the shape of the old cellar emerged. It was roughly 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. The original builders had dug it deep, and the collapse had filled it halfway. Her excavation was twofold. She was clearing the space and, at the same time, harvesting her most crucial building material, the earth itself. The clay she had discovered was a rich, dense vein running through the entire area. Her first system was for water. The seep was her lifeblood, and she treated it with reverence. She spent a week carefully excavating around it, digging a basin 3 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The work was slow and treacherous. She didn't want to disturb the source. Once the basin was dug, she began the painstaking process of lining it. She mixed the raw clay with water from the seep itself, kneading it with her bare feet until it was a thick, pliable mortar. She plastered the walls and floor of the basin, layer by layer, letting each one dry in the shade she created with a stretched blanket. She was building a cistern, a clay-lined womb to hold her water. Every evening she would watch as the water level rose, slow and steady, a fraction of an inch at a time. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Her second system was shelter. The pit itself was the foundation. The stacked stones became the base of her walls, rising 4 feet from the cellar floor. She had no lumber to frame a proper house, so she built what the land offered. She used the few gnarled junipers, felling them with her new axe. The sound of the blade biting into wood was a declaration of war against her own helplessness. She dragged the logs back to the pit, Boro helping to pull the smaller branches, and laid them across the top of the stone walls to form a low, flat roof. She wove a mat of smaller branches between the logs, then plastered the entire roof with a thick layer of her clay and grass mixture. On top of that, she piled the earth she had excavated, creating a living roof of soil a foot deep. Her home was not a house upon the land. It was a shelter within it, a burrow. From a distance, it looked like little more than a gentle swelling of the earth, a natural hillock. A single stone-lined opening served as the entrance, with a heavy door fashioned from the thickest of the old cellar timbers. Inside, it was dark and cool, the air smelling of damp earth and raw wood. It was a cave, a den, a tomb. It was home. After a month of relentless labor, She knew she needed more. She needed life. She needed something that could turn the sun and water into food. With her last few dollars, she walked the long miles back to Providence. The town had not forgotten her. Her appearance confirmed their predictions. She was thinner, her face browned by the sun, her hands calloused and scarred. Her dress was stained with clay and sweat. She walked into Gable's Mercantile. The usual crowd of men loitering by the stove fell silent. Mr. Gable paused in the middle of weighing out a sack of flour. He looked her up and down, a flicker of something, was it pity or disgust, in his eyes. "Elada," he said, his voice softer than before. "We heard you were still out there. This is no life. Come back to town. The church will find you a place." "I need 2 laying hens," she said, ignoring his offer. "A young goat, if you know of one for sale, and seeds, turnip, carrot, and potato." The silence in the store was now absolute. A man in the corner let out a choked laugh, which he quickly disguised as a cough. The absurdity of it was too much. A goat and chickens for a hole in the ground. Mr. Gable leaned forward, his expression one of grave concern. "Daughter, what will you feed them? What will you house them in? You're living in a pit. They call it Cellar shame, you know." The name stung, a flick of a whip. Cellar shame. It was cruel and dismissive and perfectly descriptive of how they saw her. "The land provides," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He shook his head, defeated by her madness. "I can sell you the hens and the seed. Farmer McGregor has a nanny goat he'd part with for $1. He sold them to her, his movements slow and sad, as if he were selling a shovel to a man determined to dig his own grave. The journey back was a spectacle. Elara leading a bleating goat on a rope, carrying a squawking chicken under each arm, with a sack of seeds on her back. Children pointed. Women whispered behind their hands. They saw the confirmation of her folly, a madwoman leading her pathetic menagerie to a home of dirt and rock. They did not see the beginning of her third system, food. Back at her cellar, she built a small, sunken pen for the goat against the side of her home, using the same stone and sod construction. The chickens were given a corner inside the shelter itself, a small coop built from salvaged wood. They were more than livestock. They were living warmth, heartbeats in the silence. Burro, after a brief period of suspicious sniffing, accepted them as part of his small, strange pack. He was her companion, her guard, her only family. He slept at the foot of her cot, a warm, breathing weight against the profound loneliness of the night. His presence was a constant, silent reassurance that she was not entirely alone. The mockery from the town was a distant noise, but it found its way to her. Jedediah Graves rode out one afternoon, his fine horse picking its way disdainfully through the rocks. He sat astride the animal, looking down at the low mound of her home, at the small, fenced-in garden she had started, at the goat chewing placidly on a weed. He didn't dismount. "So this is it," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. "The great estate. You're living like a badger in a burrow, Elara. You bring shame to my brother's memory. You bring shame to the Graves' name." "This is my name," she said, looking up at him from where she was weeding her turnip sprouts. "And my home." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that startled her chickens. "A home? This is a disgrace. When winter comes, you'll either freeze or be begging at my door. Mark my words." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over her small, green garden like a curse. But winter was not the enemy she was preparing for. The enemy was the sun. The spring rains had been sparse, and as summer tightened its grip, they stopped altogether. The sky became a vast, empty bowl of searing blue. The land grew brittle. The hardy grasses turned the color of old bone, and shattered underfoot. Her routine was dictated by the heat. She rose before dawn, in the cool, gray twilight, to do her work. She would haul water from her cistern, meticulously giving each of her plants a measured dose. She milked the goat, collected the precious eggs from her hens, and worked to reinforce her home, chinking any cracks with fresh clay. By the time the sun climbed high enough to become a malevolent force, she and her animals were inside the cool, subterranean dark of the cellar. The deep summer was a time of profound isolation. Her world shrank to the dimensions of her home and the small circle of land she tended. The rhythms were simple and relentless: water, weed, milk, mend. Inside, the air was still and cool. The smell was of damp earth, of goat and chicken, of the dried herbs she hung from the ceiling beams. It was the smell of life, contained and protected. Burro would lie by the door, his ears twitching at the sound of the hot wind scouring the world outside. She was utterly alone, the sovereign of a tiny, self-contained kingdom. She had smaller tests. A pack of coyotes, gaunt and desperate from the drought, circled her home one night, drawn by the scent of the goat. Burro's ferocious barking from the doorway, his shape a dark shadow in the opening, was enough to keep them at bay. They were not used to prey that lived within the rock and earth itself. A wildfire, sparked by a lightning strike miles away, painted the sky orange for 2 days, but the wind blew it south, away from her. Her firebreak was the barren, rocky ground that surrounded her. The land's worthlessness was its own defense. Each small victory hardened her resolve. Her systems were working. The water level in her cistern dropped, but the seep, slow and faithful, replenished it each night. Her vegetables grew, protected from the worst of the sun in their sunken beds. She was not thriving, but she was surviving. And in that summer of the great drought, survival was everything. The drought was no longer a hardship, it was a plague. For 90 days, not a single drop of rain had fallen on Providence. The sky remained a sheet of hammered brass. The town's lifeblood, Providence Creek, had vanished. What was once a ribbon of silver, then a string of muddy pools, was now a cracked, gray scar filled with the corpses of fish. The town well, the pride of the community, was the next to fail. At first, the water came up cloudy, tasting of mud and desperation. Then, one morning, the bucket came up with only a gallon of sludge. By noon, it came up empty. A collective moan of despair rose from the crowd gathered around it. The bedrock of their community, the very promise of their town's name, had turned to dust. Panic was a fever that spread faster than any sickness. The conventional structures of life collapsed. Mr. Gable's neatly stacked shelves were stripped bare of barrels and canteens. Fights broke out over rumors of a hidden spring, rumors that always proved false. The carefully tended gardens behind the houses withered, the leaves curling and blackening as if touched by fire. Cattle, their ribs stark beneath their hides, bellowed with a thirst that could not be slaked, and then fell silent. The town's confidence, its faith in its own sensible, righteous way of life, shattered. Inside her cellar home, Ilara felt the crisis only as a distant tremor. Her world remained an oasis of quiet order. The fire she lit for cooking was small, the smoke barely a wisp from the clever stone-lined flue she had built into the hillside. The air inside was cool, the thick earth roof a shield against the relentless sun. The sound of the goat chewing its cud, the soft clucking of the hens, the steady drip of the seep filling her cistern, these were the sounds of her survival. Her systems held. They were not built for prosperity, but for persistence. The seep, drawing its water from a source deep within the earth, was untouched by the surface drought. Her cistern, clay-lined and covered, lost almost nothing to evaporation. Her small garden, shaded and sunken, produced enough to feed her. She was not fighting the drought. She was living outside its reach. The contrast was absolute. Outside her door was a world of heat, dust, and death. Inside was coolness, moisture, and life. She was still there. Her world was still whole. The first sign that the outside world was breaking in came not as a person, but as a sound. Boro, lying near the entrance, lifted his head and let out a low, guttural growl that was more vibration than noise. Ilara stilled her hands, a half-mended harness in her lap. The dog rose to his feet, a dark silhouette against the bright, brutal square of daylight, the hair on his spine erect. Then she heard it, a desperate, rhythmic banging on her heavy wooden door. It was not the knock of a neighbor. It was the frantic drumming of someone at the end of their rope. She moved to the door, Boro standing defensively at her side, and pulled back the heavy wood bolt. The man who stood there, framed by the blinding sunlight, was hardly a man at all. It was Thomas, one of Jedediah's farmhands. His face was a mask of cracked, sunburnt skin, his eyes wild with terror and dehydration. He swayed on his feet, his lips black and split. "Water," he croaked, the word a dry rasp. He stumbled forward and collapsed at her feet, his body convulsing. She and Boro dragged him into the cool darkness of the cellar. She ladled water from her cistern and pressed the cup to his lips, giving him only sips at first, as she had seen her father do with foundered horses. Slowly, the life crept back into him. His eyes focused. He looked around the cellar, at the stone walls, the earthen floor, the hanging herbs, the quiet animals in the corner. He looked at her, and his gaze was filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. "The town," he whispered. "It's dying. The fever is taking the children. They're drinking from the last mud holes. Jedediah's well is dry. Everyone's is." He told her of the desperation, the sickness, the silent houses where families waited for an end. She gave him more water and a piece of bread with goat cheese. He devoured it like a wolf. As dusk fell, she saw the wagon. It moved slowly, a ghost in the twilight, pulled by a horse that looked more dead than alive. It stopped 100 yards from her home, as if afraid to approach. A man climbed down. Even in the dim light, she recognized the stiff, proud posture of Mr. Gable. He walked toward her door, his steps hesitant. He stopped before her, his hat in his hands. The confident, condescending merchant was gone. In his place was a broken man, his face etched with a terror that went beyond business or reputation. "Ilara," he began, his voice cracking. "My daughter, Mary. She has the fever. The doctor says, he says she needs clean water, or she will not see the morning." He did not ask. He did not demand. He stood before the woman he had pitied and mocked, and he begged. "Please, whatever you have, I will pay anything." The moment hung in the cool, silent air of her doorway. She looked at his face, and she saw every dismissive glance, heard every whispered joke. Cellar shame. She remembered the laughter in his store, the smug certainty that he knew best, that her path was one of folly and ruin. The bitter memory coiled in her gut. Her water was finite. Her survival was a delicate balance, won through blood and sweat. These people had cast her out to die, and now they came to her for life. But then she looked past him, at the slumped shape of his wife in the wagon, and she thought of a small child, hot with fever, crying for a drink that would not come. The choice was not about them. It was not about revenge or vindication. It was about the water. The water did not belong to her. It came from the earth. She was merely its keeper. The moral calculus was brutally simple. She had it, and they did not. A child was dying. "Bring your barrels," she said, her voice even. The choice was made, not because they deserved it, but because she could. Because in the world she had built from nothing, there was no room for the kind of cruelty they had shown her. She led him not to the cistern itself, but to the overflow channel she had dug, a place where the slow, steady surplus trickled out. She filled his barrels herself, lifting the heavy buckets of cool, clear water. The act was a sacrament. She was pouring out her own hard-won survival for the man who had named her home a disgrace. She gave him 2 full barrels and then went inside and returned with a jug of goat's milk. "For the girl," she said. "It is fresh." Mr. Gable stood in stunned silence as the water gurgled into his barrels. He looked from the life-giving stream to the low, earthen mound of her home. He peered into the doorway, and his eyes widened. He saw what Thomas had seen, but with the sharp eye of a merchant who understood systems and stock. He saw not a dirty pit, but a fortress of ingenuity. The air inside was cool, a miracle in the baked landscape. He saw the neat rows of preserved vegetables in clay pots, the healthy animals, the deep, dark pool of the cistern. He saw the logic, the brutal, elegant efficiency of it all. This was not the hovel of a madwoman. It was a masterpiece of survival. The shame he had named it for was not hers. It was his. It belonged to all of them. He looked at her hands, scarred and calloused, and then at her face, calm and resolute. He saw no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only a quiet, unnerving grace. He could not reconcile the woman before him with the pitiable fool from his memory. They were 2 different people, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had been wrong about everything. He returned to Providence a changed man. The water and milk saved his daughter's life. The next morning, as the sun rose to begin another day of its assault, he returned. He was not alone. Behind his wagon was a line of others, a funereal procession of the town's leaders, the sheriff, the pastor, Jedediah Graves himself, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief and humiliation. They stopped where he had stopped the night before. Mr. Gable walked forward alone and stood before Alara. "We were wrong," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. It was not an apology, it was a confession. "We called this place Cellar Shame. We laughed at you. My God, we were the fools." He gestured back at the town elders. "The town is finished without your help. We ask for nothing. We are here to beg." Jedediah's face went purple with rage, but he said nothing. He was beaten. The land he had discarded as worthless was now the only thing standing between Providence and its extinction. The woman he had cast out now held all their lives in her hands. Elada looked at the line of desperate faces. She felt the weight of their judgment, their scorn, their foolish pride, and she let it go. It was a burden she had no need to carry. Her response was not in words, but in action. She nodded once, a gesture of profound and quiet authority. "One family at a time," she said. 2 buckets each. No more until everyone has had their turn. The animals come after the people." She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She simply provided. She stood by her cistern, the heart of her world, and doled out life, bucket by bucket. She showed them how to conserve it, how to make every drop count. Her quiet grace was more powerful than any sermon, more humbling than any rebuke. She was not their victim. She was not their savior. She was simply the one who had listened to the land when they had all been shouting at it. The drought broke, as all things do. It ended not with a gentle shower, but with a violent, dramatic thunderstorm that tore across the plains and turned the dry creek bed into a raging torrent overnight. The people of Providence stood in the rain, their faces turned to the sky, and wept with relief. But the memory of the long, dry death did not wash away. It had scoured them down to the bone, revealing a hard and vital truth. In the weeks that followed, the town did not forget. The path to Ilara's home, once a faint track, became a well-worn road. They came not to beg for water, but to ask for knowledge. Mr. Gable was the first, his pride replaced by a deep and genuine humility. He asked her about the clay, about how she had known to build the cistern, how she had read the signs in the earth that everyone else had ignored. Ilara, quiet and patient, taught them. She showed them how to find the veins of clay, how to mix it, how to build walls that held water as if they were cupped hands. She explained the principle of her sunken gardens, how they conserved moisture and sheltered plants from the wind. She spoke of the earth not as a thing to be broken and conquered, but as a partner to be understood. Led by Gable and a silent, chastened Jedediah Graves, the men of the town began to dig. They did not just repair the old well. They dug new ones, deeper than before, and lined them with clay according to Ilara's instruction. They built a great town cistern, a massive version of her own, hidden beneath the earth near the meeting hall, a reserve for the dry times they now knew would come again. They rebuilt their community, not on a foundation of pride, but on the hard-won wisdom of a woman they had cast out. The name Cellar Shame was never spoken again. In its place, a new one grew, spoken with reverence. They called it the Wellspring. Her home became a landmark, a testament to what could be built from what was thrown away. Travelers passing through were told the story of the drought and the widow who had saved them, and they carried the tale with them, spreading her legacy like seeds on the wind. Ilara never moved back to town. The wellspring was her home, her creation, her peace. She lived there for the rest of her days, a quiet pillar of the community she had once been exiled from. She never married again, but she was never truly alone. The people of Providence became her family, Borrow's descendants her constant companions. Years later, an old woman with hands as gnarled and strong as juniper roots, she would sit by her doorway in the evening. She would watch the sun set over a valley that was green and alive, a valley that had learned the bitter lesson of thirst. She had not sought victory over those who wronged her. She had not asked for justice. She had simply refused to be broken. In the cool, quiet dark of her cellar home, surrounded by the steady, rhythmic sounds of a life she had built with her own two hands, she had found something far more valuable than vengeance. She had found grace. Her legacy was not written in a will or carved on a tombstone. It was in the cool, clear water that flowed from every well in Providence, a quiet, life-giving whisper that rose from the heart of the earth.